The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Melanie Napoleon, and I'm Senior Director of Great Lakes Conservation here at Shedd Aquarium. I'd like to welcome you all to Shedd Aquarium and to what is going to be a very informative and interesting program tonight. We are so pleased to be able to provide our space in partnership with the University of Chicago for this important dialogue. Here at Shedd Aquarium, we use our trusted voice to inspire people to act to protect the Great Lakes. And certainly invasive species are a serious concern to us as they threaten local native wildlife, animals, plants. Certainly Asian carp have gotten a lot of attention lately in the press. That's why we're really excited to be able to host this event tonight and to be able to have a very informed discussion about the threat that Asian carp pose, to learn a little bit more about them, learn a little bit more about the issues. So thanks for coming out tonight, and many thanks to Reuben Keller and University of Chicago for putting this wonderful event together. We actually do have Asian carp here on display, and unfortunately the aquarium is closes at 6. But if you have an opportunity to come back, I'd encourage you to come by our local waters gallery, visit the Great Lakes Invasive Species exhibit, and get right up close and personal to these critters so you can see really what we're dealing with. So without much further ado, I'll turn it over to Reuben. Thanks again.
So thanks, Melanie, and special thanks to the Shedd for hosting this event. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this World Beyond the Headlines event, Asian carp invasion, potential economic and ecological impacts in the Great Lakes. And this is the first event in our spring quarter series. And just again, my name is Reuben Keller, and I'm a lecturer in the program on the global environment at the University of Chicago. So the World Beyond the Headlines series is a collaborative effort. I need to speak louder. The World Beyond the Headlines series is a collaborative effort between the University of Chicago Center for International Studies, International House Global Voices program, and the Seminary Co-op bookstores. And for this event, we're also very pleased to have partnered with the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, and obviously with the Shedd Aquarium. We hope that you'll join us. It's actually this Thursday at 3 p.m. at the University of Chicago for the second spring World Beyond the Headlines event. We have the Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who'll be speaking about Afghanistan, the lessons learned after 8 years, and implications for future operations of NATO in Afghanistan. Additionally, the University of Chicago Sustainability Council and the Chicago Environmental Policy Association will host a discussion about Asian carp, and in particular the potential for closing the locks on the waterway. This event will be moderated by Josh Ellis, who you will hear more from this evening, and it will take place in the lecture hall in the Harris School for Public Policy from 5 to 6:30 p.m. on Monday, April 19th. And there's information about both of those events on your way out at the tables, so you don't need to copy all that down. We're really lucky. Tonight's event is being audio and video recorded. It will be posted on the Center for International Studies website. I won't try and read out that website, but go to the Center for International Studies website in a couple of weeks, and the whole event will be posted there. Now, before we begin, there are several people that I need to thank. It was eye-opening for me to be involved in this organisation and to see just how much work goes into it. So first and foremost, the Shedd have provided space for this event, and they provided the time of some extremely capable and helpful staff. In particular, I want to thank Melanie Napoleon, Paulette Pierre, Dennis Frankenfield, and John Siska. The Shedd has also organised for some of their volunteers to be here, and in fact my whole freshwater ecology class is here volunteering. And additionally, as I mentioned, we work very closely with Benjamin Brooks from the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, and we'll have a couple of words about their program now.
Thank you, Ruben. My name is Lance Grandy, and I'm Senior Vice President and Head of Collections and Research at the Field Museum, but I'm also on the Board of Directors for the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, or C2ST as we like to call it. This organization includes most of the major research institutions in the Chicago region, and it's this diversity of research that allows C2ST to produce a wide range of programs each month. It features some of the best scientific and technological minds in the region. C2ST is a membership-based organization. What does that mean? Well, it means we depend on you to help support us. So we encourage you to be a member and help promote public discussions about scientific issues like the one we're going to hear this evening. Our next program, Women in Science, is a day-long symposium that's going to take place on the Chicago campus at Northwestern University on April 17th. And for more information about this program and other programs in C2ST, please see Justin and Jillian, two of our staff members, at the back on a table in the lobby. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Ruben.
Okay, so very briefly, the format for the evening is 5 presentations, which will each take approximately 15 minutes. So please hold questions until the end, and if we all keep on time, then we should have at least half an hour at the end, where I'll invite each of the presenters up onto the stage, and we'll have panel discussion and audience questions. So the first presenter is David Lodge, who is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. He's also the director of the Centre for Aquatic Conservation and director of the new Environmental Change Initiative at the University of Notre Dame. He's a freshwater ecologist who's been active at the interface of science and policy for invasive species for many years. He was also my dissertation advisor. And he'll be talking tonight about the history of invasions through the Chicago waterway system and also the eDNA, the environmental DNA work that he's been involved in as a leader. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruben, and the other organizers in the shed for a great venue and a program during which I hope to learn a great deal from my other speakers and from you in the audience. Look forward to the discussion period afterward. So in the spirit of this symposium as being sort of behind the headlines, I wanted to focus in my remarks tonight not so much on the 2 species that I've pictured here on the front, this bighead and silver carp, although I will get around to those. But I wanted to put this issue of that we've come to know through the lens of bighead and silver carp into a little bit of a broader context and focus on this waterway, this network of connecting waterways that we sometimes call the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. And when I say any of those things, I'm referring to this whole network of waterways in Chicago. And what I want to do is address really 4 questions that we'll come to in a minute. And they're, on the face of them, they're quite simple questions. But of course, with all real-world questions, they get more complicated as we dive in. But I want to take a retrospective view, looking at the past invasions that have used this waterway. So I'm going to focus on biological invasions and the importance of this waterway with biological invasions. Look at the ones we're worried about right now, and also alert you to some that may have the potential to invade in the future. I also want to make clear at the beginning, as I've done with listing these other names on this first slide, that what I'm going to represent is the product of a lot of collaboration, particularly involving those people that I've listed here, Dr. Andy Mahon and Dr. Chris Jurdy and Lindsay Chatterton of the Nature Conservancy. In the work that we've been doing in the past few months on the Chicago Canal. So these are the 4 questions I'm going to answer. The first one is to put this Chicago Canal in a broader context. If we can go to the next slide. What I want to point out is that this canal connects 2 of the greatest waterways, or two of the greatest watersheds, the river basins of North America. One being the Mississippi River Basin in the lower left, that drains roughly 40 to 50% of the land area of the United States, and the other, the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Basin, pictured in the upper right. And these Chicago area canals connect those two. They were not naturally connected, except perhaps in the rare event of very high water conditions, but certainly they were not connected in a way that allowed free movement of organisms. But beginning around the turn of the 20th century, we connected these and opened up the possibility of organisms moving through them. Now, one of the ironies of the history of this waterway is that for a long time it was so contaminated with Chicago's sewage, which of course was the original motivation for its construction, that it could not be a conduit for movements of organisms. But with the Clean Water Act and the gradual and now dramatic resulting improvements in water quality, this waterway is now a perfectly good habitat for many organisms, including those that we'll focus on in a few minutes. So that's the big picture. We've got a human-built canal that connects two of the great watersheds of North America that historically had very different groups of organisms in them. The Great Lakes characterized by its own set of organisms, and the Mississippi River by another. We can go to the next slide. Now, why does this matter? Let me just illustrate that with what we biologists have come to understand in recent years about invasions, the movements and introduction of organisms in places on the planet where they did not originally occur. So I've just put three examples here from three different well-known waterways on the globe. And what I've plotted here is the cumulative number of non-native species discovered in these three waterways over time, from 1850 to 2000. And we can just look at the Great Lakes as an example. The number of species, alien species, that now occur in the Great Lakes is on the order of somewhere between 186 and 190 that we know about. All of those species now have access not only to the Great Lakes, where many of them were originally introduced by shipping, but because of that canal, to the Mississippi watershed also. Likewise, the Mississippi Basin is not as well studied, but there are lots of organisms that have been introduced to the Mississippi Basin from elsewhere on the planet that have access to the Great Lakes. So if we can go to the next slide, then what we see is this gradual accumulation now of a very large number of non-native species in each of these basins, and we've seen historically the importance, in the last few decades especially, the importance of this canal in the dispersal of some highly damaging species. I've illustrated 4 examples here of species that have the potential to move southward from the Great Lakes Basin. 3 very well-known ones, the zebra mussel, the quagga mussel, and the round goby, another more obscure one, Cordylophora. The first 3 are well-known because they have caused so many changes in the ecology of the Great Lakes and in other areas, and especially as zebra mussels and quagga mussels have dispersed across the continent, most recently arriving in California in 2007 and 2008. Those species have caused millions of dollars in damage, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage every year. And we can trace those back to their original introduction in the United States by shipping into the Great Lakes. How did they get further south initially? Through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, from whence they've dispersed westward. So the canal has a history of being used by species that we have already experienced to be highly damaging and disruptive to human society, to our economy, and to the environment. If we can go to the next slide, there are also many, many species, as I suggested with the graph from the Great Lakes. There are many species that, if you will, are poised, have the potential to move in each direction. Let me give you some examples, and if we can go sequentially through a series of slides, and you can sort of keep going here as I talk about them. The next slide. So I've illustrated here just a few selections. This is the spiny water flea, which is introduced first into the Great Lakes. It occurs in the Great Lakes now, but of course, it too could use the canal to disperse southward like zebra mussels, quagga mussels, and round gobies have already done. Or we could think of water chestnut in the next slide, a species of plant, an aquatic weed that has been highly damaging, on which many dollars are spent every year to control in other parts of North America. If it were to disperse southward, vast new areas, the Mississippi Basin, could be opened up to further damages that would be quite costly to human society, disruptive of recreation, disruptive of fisheries, and so forth. In the next slide, an example to illustrate, there's a bloody-looking fish there, to illustrate a whole variety of fish pathogens and parasites that occur in the Great Lakes Basin, but not yet in the Mississippi, and we could also say the same in reverse. So we not only have fishes moving through, but of course the possibility of fish diseases moving through. Next slide. The New Zealand mud snail, a species that has been very disruptive in some other parts of the world. It occurs in the Great Lakes, has not become really a nuisance in the Great Lakes. It could, maybe it won't, but it could, and it could certainly disperse into habitats that would be very favorable in the Mississippi Basin. Or the next example, if we can go to the next slide, the bloody red shrimp, one of the more recent invaders in the Great Lakes. Again, no reason why it couldn't use the canal to disperse southward. Or if we now start thinking about species that exist in the Mississippi Basin and could move northward, if we look at the next slide, we've got our bighead carp, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. Next slide. Silver carp, next slide. Brazilian waterweed, a whole variety of aquatic plants that are known from unfortunately long experience in other parts of the world, in other parts of North America, could be very disruptive and costly if they invade. We could also add Eurasian river ruff to the species that could move southward from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. We could go on, as remember that graph that I showed you, 186 species in the Great Lakes. We could go on with examples of species that could move in one direction or the other. My main point in going through this is we know this has happened in the past, zebra mussels, quagga mussels. We know it's going on now with silver carp and bighead carp. We know there are lots of species that could do this in the future. This whole issue should not be framed, and this is my important point, this whole issue should not be framed in terms of silver and bighead carp only. It's about lots of other species, and depending on how long-term a view you want to take, it's about many species. If we can go to the next slide, please. Forgot there's a snakehead. That one also could be coming northward. Northern snakehead. You can see one of those in the shed, too, if you come back. So now I want to begin to focus on the carp. So I've just made the case that it's not just about carp, but of course the reason we're all here having this symposium this year is because we've been focused on Asian carp, or rather Asian carp have focused our attention on what I hope I'm convincing you is a much broader issue. But let's think about these two species of carp, silver and bighead carps. Just the last in a series of carps that have invaded North America from Asia. So how close are they? It's the team of my researchers, led by the people that I mentioned on the first slide, that have been tracking the existence of Asian carp or the location of Asian carp using eDNA techniques in the waterway over the last few months. If we can go to the next slide. So we've known these silver carp and bighead carp were coming for a long time. I think Dwayne Chapman will talk more about this in a few minutes. I'm just giving you a couple or three snapshots here in time of where we know silver carp were. It's no surprise that they're knocking on the doorstep of the Great Lakes. What our work has done in recent months is simply accelerate the timeline that we thought we had to respond to this threat. What we've discovered using this eDNA technique that I'll explain in a moment is simply that they're more advanced than we thought they were. But that's a difference of 20 or 30 miles. So we knew they were coming. Next slide. So what do we mean when we're talking about eDNA? Think about this as the environmental protection equivalent or human society protection equivalent, whatever your perspective is, of what forensic scientists do every day. They gather evidence from crime scenes to see whether they can detect the DNA that indicates the presence of a suspect at a crime scene. We're used to making important decisions on this kind of evidence every day. We send people to jail on this kind of evidence. We get people out of jail on this kind of evidence. So all we've done is apply this kind of approach, existing technology in some novel ways, to detect whether or not silver or bighead carp are present, or rather whether they are. The not is a little problematic. I'll be happy to go into that later. So all we're doing is taking a water sample, filtering that water sample, capturing whatever little bits of tissue that Asian carp have left in a trail behind them, just as you and I leave a trail of bits of tissue and DNA behind us. We're simply detecting that. And one of the things that we think is working in our favor with these fishes is that their feces float, and with feces come some cells from the intestinal lining of these fish. So that may be one of the things we're detecting. No matter where exactly the tissue comes from, we're detecting the DNA from either silver or bighead carp, not from any other fish. In the next slide, this is where we found the DNA. It's no surprise to anyone, even before we got involved, that silver and bighead carp were down here in the southern parts of the waterway. What our work has done in the last few months, supported by the Army Corps of Engineers, is to discover that the DNA of the fish are present in these upper waterways, just south of the electric barriers, and most disturbingly, above the electric barrier. And the worst news that we have had to deliver is the discovery of eDNA of silver carp in Calumet Harbor, so open to the Great Lakes. So again, what we've done is simply reveal the presence of the fish far more northward than they were thought to occur previously, including, importantly, above the electric barrier. So we can come back to this pattern and what it means and what it might not mean, or how they got there, and I'll go into that in a minute, but I'd be happy to entertain questions about this later. So if we can go to the next slide. I do want to spend just a couple of minutes on thinking about how did they get there. They're above the barrier. What does this imply for how they got there? And that's important to know, because what does that imply about what we can do about it? So if we go to the next slide, I want to throw three possibilities out there for how the carp got there. One is, if we can go to the next slide, that they circumvented the barrier, either because the barrier isn't 100% effective, or because the barrier is not operating 100% of the time, or because the barrier was circumvented by flooding that connected the Des Plaines River and the canal itself. There are a number of possibilities that would have potentially, we don't know this for sure, but potentially would have allowed the fish to circumvent or go through the electric barriers. A second possibility is that these fish, particularly juvenile fish, might be used as live bait, and if they are, they might be released or escape from anglers using them for live bait. And the third possibility that I think is most, these are three of the most plausible possibilities. The third one in the next slide is released by humans. It's not a surprise. It's well known that there are some cultural practices, sometimes called prayer release, involving the release of live Asian carps. And that may very well be the source of some Asian carps. I would think that has happened on occasion, at least. There is no way for us or anyone else to know for sure where any particular fish came from or how it got there. But these are some possibilities. Next slide. Okay, so I want to close just with this last question briefly, and again, we could come back to this. How many carp would it take to launch an invasion? And in other words, because we believe we've detected silver carp in Calumet Harbor, does that mean that there is an established self-sustaining invasion of silver carp in Lake Michigan going on? And I want to say the answer to that is no. We can't know for certain, but there are good reasons to think that the release of a few individuals or the escape of a few individuals would not necessarily initially cause an invasion. It's also important to recognize that we have not found any evidence that bighead carp are in Lake Michigan. So again, we can come back and talk about this later about why I think this, but this is very important. The game is not over if the goal is protecting the Great Lakes from invasion. I believe what our results and our surveillance show is that it is just more urgent than we thought previously, more urgent than ever to prevent additional individuals from entering the lake. It's a numbers game. The more individual fish that get in the lake, the more likely a self-sustaining population, what we biologists would refer to as an invasion, the more likely that is to happen, the more individuals escape into the lake. If we can finish with the next slide, just want to remind you that when we're talking about the waterway, it's not only about Asian carp. If you can just flip through that carousel again quickly, just to remind people it's not only about Asian carp. And you can think of this as if we're playing roulette. We're spinning this roulette. Which species is going to use the canal next is hard to say, but it is a certainty that additional species will use the canal if additional management actions are not taken. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dwayne Chapman, who is a research fish biologist with the United States Geological Survey. He's one of the preeminent Asian carp biologists in the country, and he's had quite a unique role in that he's very much at the cutting edge of the ecology and pushing what we know about the biology of these species, and he's also been strongly involved in a lot of management action. He's travelled all the way from Missouri to be with us tonight, and he's going to talk about ecological risk of Asian carp to the Great Lakes. Thanks, Dwayne.
Well, what I'm going to talk about today has to do a lot with the uncertainties, and I'm probably going to leave you more confused than you were when you came in. Some of you probably are pretty not confused at all, think that it's a done deal one way or the other, and you ought to be a little confused, as I am. And So, I'm talking about what happens if they get into the Great Lakes, assuming they get into the Great Lakes, right? And I'm going to provide ammo for both sides of the debate about whether they could become a problem or not. I want you to try to take a look at the whole question, not just one particular side of it. The take-homes that I want to talk about, that I want you to pick up from this thing are, should you worry about Asian carp? Well, yeah. I mean, it's definitely has the possibility of being a big problem. These fish are environmental engineers. They are known to change the environment where they invade, much like the zebra mussels have done in the Great Lakes. They could have other undesirable effects. But there's a lot of uncertainty about this whole thing. We do not know for sure exactly what's going to happen. There will be most likely unequal effects on different types of fishes. It would be really strange if they were able to come in and wipe out all parts of this $7 billion or whatever it's worth fishery in the Great Lakes. It would very likely, if they become very abundant, there will be negative effects, but there would be not an equal distribution of effects across the entire Great Lakes Basin, and also not against all species of fish. And also I want to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the speed of invasion, which probably won't be very fast if it does happen. So next slide. These are the bad boys here. The big head carp at the top. That is a relatively skinny one, by the way. Missouri River skinny big head. This is a silver carp. This is a grass carp. And this is a black carp. Now all four of these fish are Asian carps. And when you say Asian carps in this country, we're usually talking about these fish, although there are many, many more Asian carps than this in the world. Sometimes when you say Asian carp, you're just talking about these two. And that's, again, the big head and the silver carp, these filter feeders. These are the planktivores that feed at the bottom of the food chain. They don't eat 40% of their body weight per day, as you will see in, umpteen newspaper releases. But they do eat, sometimes under ideal conditions, maybe about half that. And that's a lot. And they can definitely change the systems they invade. Next slide, please. Okay, they are native to Eastern Asia. almost to Vietnam with the silver carp, and then there's another species of silver carp which is native to Vietnam, and they go well into Russia. I mean, it's not just along the Amur River. The silver carp, in particular, it's native to well into Russia, well up along the coastal parts of it. And again, they primarily are planktivores. These fish are primarily lake fish. You'll see some people say in the media that these are river fishes. Why would we worry about the Great Lakes? They are not river fishes. They are lake fishes that spawn in rivers. They require rivers for spawning. They don't like to live in rivers. And if they do live in rivers, they live in off-channel, low-velocity habitats. They do, however, require these low-velocity they require large rivers to be able to spawn, or at least they think we do, because they need this drift. The eggs and larvae drift in the current. They are heavier than water, and if the water velocity is not high enough, they'll sink to the bottom, where we think they die. But we still have insecurity about that too. Next slide. Okay, first I want to talk about what do the experts think. Well, this lodge up here, this is David that just spoke, and Cindy Kolar, Dr. Cindy Kolar, a good friend of mine, they developed a model back in 2002. It's published in the journal Science, where they looked at the life history of parameters of a lot of different kinds of organisms which had invaded the Great Lakes, and then developed this model and looked at a lot of other creatures that might invade the Great Lakes. And what they determined with silver carp was, yeah, they probably could establish in the Great Lakes, but they would most likely be slow to expand their range, and they might not become a problem, and they expressed uncertainty about it, which is a legitimate thing to do. Then there's Mandrake and Cudmore in 2004. This is put out by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. Again, this was a classic risk assessment based on the best guesses of scientists. And you take, in a classic risk assessment, you get all the data you can figure out about a species together, and you get the best minds on it together, and you decide, basically, what you think is most likely that we have a problem. And they decided there was a high risk of establishment. And then there's this book, Kolar et al., 2007. I'm an author on this. And it's a risk assessment not just for the Great Lakes, but for North America, as well as a biological synopsis. And again, the Great Lakes is only a small part of what we did in this, but the summary, to make it short, is that we decided that we really couldn't make a decision on whether or not bighead and silver carp could become a big problem in the Great Lakes. But we did say that if they became very abundant, that they would be problematic. Next slide. Okay, now, there are Asian carps in the Great Lakes. And we have 5 large bighead carp have been captured from Lake Erie already. Now, the probability of capture of any of these fish is very small. They don't get caught on hooks. They're not susceptible really to any of the commercial fishing gear that's out there that's being used now. So we're really lucky to catch one. So if there's one out there. So there's probably a lot more than 5 fish still swimming around out there. And I have had reports of people who had seen them. These were very large, healthy fish. They were extremely fat fish, twice as fat by condition factor as my fish in Missouri. These were very healthy fish, doing very good. And this was after the biggest one there was captured 12 years after the discovery of zebra mussels in the Great Lakes, which means that we were already seeing impacts on availability of planktonic food for bighead and silver carp by the time that these things were caught. So now we've got all these fish in the Great Lake, in Lake Erie, and we've not seen any spawning. No young fish. No evidence of spawning. What does that mean? Next slide. Well, all it really means is that we know that bighead carp can do well in Lake Erie. Individual ones can do very well, and they are very healthy fish. We did find that most of those fish, by the way, were caught in the open lake. None of these fish were caught in rivers. We don't know if the bighead carp would be able to do as well in the larger, less productive lakes, like Lake Michigan. We don't know that yet. There's no known reproduction. Now, to what do we attribute this? Is it because there's not enough fish? Maybe they haven't been there long enough? Or maybe they can't do it. Well, really, we haven't had a good test yet. And I'll be talking more about some of these different reasons as we move through this. But really, the answer to that question is we don't know yet. Next slide. Okay. this is important to understand, the timing of the invasion. You'll hear a lot in the media that these fish were, escaped in the 93 flood or in the floods of the early 90s, and it's just not true. I mean, some of them may have escaped in those floods, but they really were out a lot longer than that. The first silver carp was caught from the wild probably less than a year after they were first imported to the United States in the early 70s. The big head carp weren't actually captured from the wild until 1982, but like I said, these fish can exist under the radar for a long time. I believe they were probably present in the wild for a lot longer than that. When this one fish was caught in 1982, it was followed by several captures all around the basin and within the same year. But it took 20 to 25 years for those fish to become really, really common to where you could actually expect to go out and find them. And this is a really common thing when an invasive species comes into a new habitat. You go through a lag phase where they just exist at a low level for a long time, and then the population will hit an incremental growth phase where they'll go just cruise along like this, and then they'll shoot up. And that's what we saw with big head and silver carp. They were out there for 20, 25 years, and all of a sudden something happened, and it might have been related to the floods of the early 90s. It might have given them a good foothold, and they took off. Now, when and if the fish are able to get into the Great Lakes and get a foothold, I do think it will take at least as long for several reasons. One, there's the Lodge paper says, yeah, it's going to take a long time. They're not the kind of fish that expands very rapidly. The Great Lakes are colder, so it's going to take longer for a fish to reach maturity. So it's going to lengthen out this lag phase. They're so big, it's just going to take the Great Lakes are that it's going to take a long time just to fill them up. So I do think it's very likely that if they do get established in the Great Lakes, that it will take a long time. Now, this affords us an opportunity. There are things we can do. It's not a done deal that these fish, once they get in there, are going to be able to take off and become huge problems. There are things we can do about that. I don't have a lot of time to talk about the things we can do, but there are things we can do. But on the other hand, 10 years from now, if these fish are established in the Great Lakes, very likely everybody will have lost interest in this because there won't be a problem. I can almost guarantee that big head and silver carp won't be a problem in the Great Lakes 10 years from now. If they're a problem, it's going to be 25, 30 years down the road. So that's when the hammer's going to fall, if it ever does happen. Next slide. So if the Asian carp achieve high densities, some areas are going to be worse than others. Some areas are going to have better habitat. They're going to be more abundant. They're going to have and it's hard to identify where those spots are at this point in time. We don't, there isn't another place exactly like the Great Lakes where these fish have invaded. We do have the Caspian Sea, which is really huge, but it's also salty. It has a lot of other things going on for it. By the way, the Caspian Sea, the Russians were trying to establish these fish in the Caspian Sea for like 30 years before they were successful. It's the same kind of thing, this lag phase, that they were able to eventually get the population to be really sky high, but it took them a long time trying. But another thing that is different species of fish are likely to be affected differently from others. So I wouldn't expect every fish to be wiped out of the Great Lakes. In studies in this country and other places, planktivorous fish that eat plankton throughout their life cycle, were heavily affected. Fish with young that live out in the middle of the water, we call them pelagic fishes, the very young fishes. Those fish decline dramatically in other countries where the fish are in lakes, right? There's a lot more information about lakes out there than there is in rivers. But fish like the European walleye, when silver carp were introduced, they cratered. But fishes that had early life stages that hung around the banks, they weren't affected hardly at all. So that's the kind of thing we may see here in the Great Lakes. It might be different because the Great Lakes are not the same as lakes in Europe. Upsides to the invasion are hard to find. I don't really think, I don't want to say there's winners and losers because I really don't see any potential effect of, say, commercial fishery that might develop on Asian carps in the Great Lakes being a really big plus. I don't see that as being there's hard to find an upside, but there are degrees of downsides. Next slide. So these are the things that have primarily been considered to be the big factors that might keep them from establishing in the Great Lakes. One was water hardness, and we published a paper, actually USGS has published 2 different papers, one on bighead and one on silver carp, to show that water hardness in the Great Lakes is not going to be a problem. So that is not an issue now. I won't talk about it anymore. Then the spawning and early life history parameters, and we talked a little bit about that, but I'll get to that some more in a minute. Then food resources. The bighead and silver carp need a certain amount of food. They may not find it in the bigger Great Lakes. Temperature has been brought up as an issue, and propagule pressure, and which means the number of fishes, the number of organisms that invade, essentially. Next slide. We're going to start those from the bottom and go back up that list. And again, propagule pressure is defined as the number and quality of organisms that invade, that could potentially be parents of other fish or organisms. In invasion biology, usually you find that a few organisms is not enough. You have to get more than one. Most invasions are not successful. Many times, an introduction has to happen multiple times and lots of organisms for it to become successful to invade. Only about 10% of introductions of invasive species are actually successful. But if you increase that number of organisms that are getting in, the chances of that invasion go up. Again, the size of the invaded environment is really important too. Invasions of only a very few organisms of terrestrial organisms on an island have been shown to be very successful in taking off, because they have a much smaller area that they're invading. But if you take that same number of organisms and drop it in on a continent, you're not going to have the same chance of invasion. So the Great Lakes are a really big place to try to invade. So there's some other reasons too that I don't have time to get into, but the number of organisms is extremely important. But we always have this chance that the right 2 fish could get together at the right place with only 2 fish. It's possible, but not very likely. Next slide. Okay, moving on. Another thing that might help us out is that carp are thought to be mass spawners. When we do see them spawning, there are tremendous numbers of fish all together in the same place. We don't really know how important that is. Do they need to have all the pheromones released to be able to get a lot of fish together to really pull off a spawn in the wild? We don't know. We can spawn 2 or 3 fish in a tank in the laboratory, but we don't know about the wild. The failure of those bighead carp that were found in Lake Erie to recruit might be a result of low propagule pressure, although there are other reasons why it could possibly be. And there also, you have to remember, these fish can exist under the radar for a long time, especially the small ones that are really, really hard to find. Is some small possibility, and I consider this a very small possibility, but it cannot be ruled out, is that they have not failed, that they have reproduced in Lake Erie, and that we'll find out about it 10, 15, 20 years from now. Next slide. Okay, temperature. Again, temperature is not likely to stop the invasion of, that is, keep fish from surviving in the Great Lakes. They will be able to survive the temperatures that are there. But there are other parts of the life cycle that temperature might affect. If the development of eggs and larvae is slower, so if they have a cold river they're spawning in, it's going to take a longer river. So these things could add up to be able to keep the fish from successfully invading. Next slide. And these are scary slides, but what they are pictures of the temperature from the native ranges of these fish and brought over and slapped onto to the United States and North America. And so that's a temperature range. Those particular areas in red and pink are areas that have the temperature ranges that those fish would experience in their native range. So, but again, remember that lots of things besides air temperature affect where fish can live. Next slide. Food resources. Now, there's been a lot of talk about whether these fish are going to be able to live in Lake Michigan, because there's just not so much food out there, especially since the invasion of zebra mussels. Chlorophyll concentrations and plankton concentrations are extremely low now in the Great Lakes in Lake Michigan. And they might not be able to find enough food to live out there. According to the study by Cook et al., where they developed a model based on decide how much they would actually need, they said we'd need 10 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll for a fish feeding primarily on phytoplankton to just survive without even swimming or breeding. Based on that model, though, parts of Lake Erie have a lot of plankton, and they would do very well. Well, we've seen that in Lake Erie, they did do very well, so that makes sense. But according to that model, they should not do well in Lake Michigan. But on the other hand, Asian carp are not obligatory plankton feeders. That is their primary food, their primary way of feeding, but they can feed in other ways. We just don't know if they can make a very good living on some of these other places, other foods in the Great Lakes. And we also know that carp do live on other things successfully, and they live on less than that amount in other places. Next slide. This is in Lake Balaton in Hungary. It's about a fifth the size of Lake Erie. It has, in the part of the lake where they catch the carp, which is actually lower in plankton than the other part of the lake. It's kind of like Lake Erie. You get one end that's a lot more abundant or productive than the other. But Lake Balaton has the same kind of thing going on. In the less productive end, that's where the fish are, for whatever reason, I don't know. But in that end of the lake, it's about half. They have about half the plankton that that would be shown in that model, that would seem to be required by the Cook model. By the way, I also want to mention again, this fish lived in the open lake in Lake Balaton, not in the rivers. And interestingly, they don't jump very much there. They can't make them jump. I don't know what the deal is. Next slide. But this is what a silver carp looks like from Lake Balaton. The average fish in Lake Balaton that's caught in their sampling regime is bigger than the biggest silver carp I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen thousands and thousands of them. So, they can do quite well on a lot less food than you would find in the Cook model. And those ovaries, by the way, by rough back-of-the-envelope calculation, that fish probably has about 3 million eggs. Next slide. Asian carps have a great deal of flexibility in their feeding. We talked about these different opportunities. They can, in the Missouri River, in our studies in the Missouri River, they eat primarily detritus. They didn't eat plankton. They eat the stuff that they're finding in their guts is like insect feces and bits of leaves and that sort of thing, because there really isn't any or very much plankton most of the time in the Missouri River. At times when there is plankton, they'll select places where there is plankton, but most of the time there isn't that much, and they didn't feed on it because it wasn't out there. The silver carp, by the way, can filter down to the bacteria stage. They can get some really, really small stuff with those gill rakers that they have. And they actually have a system with their gut where they actually grow bacteria in their foregut and digest the bacteria in the hindgut, which means they can subsist on things that most fish wouldn't be able to survive on. I mean, it may not be an organic source that a normal fish would be able to live on. But we don't know yet whether those whether they can actually break down cellulose or something like that, for example, but we intend to find out. Next slide. So again, many unknowns. We don't know if Asian carp could subsist on quagga and zebra mussel pseudofeces in the Great Lakes, but they very well might be able to, and it does seem like the kind of thing they would do well on. If you're familiar with Cladophora, it's an algae that grows attached and then it breaks off and drifts around, and it's really abundant now because the zebra mussels and quagga mussels have cleaned the water so much that the light hits all the way to the bottom. So we now have blooms of this Cladophora. It's not plankton, but maybe the fish, maybe big-headed silver carp can eat it. And it's very likely, I think, that they would be able to eat and take advantage of that. Blue-green blooms have become more abundant in the Great Lakes since the invasion of the Dracaenid mussels, and that is a zebra and zebra and quagga mussels. And we don't know whether these fish are going to be able to take advantage of that intermittent food source of those blue-green blooms, intermittent and local food sources. But we will be looking at that also in the near future. Next slide. Last limitation here is the spawning limitations. We talked about how they need this length of river. One very rough estimate of the minimum length of river required is 100 kilometers, 60 miles. We don't know for sure exactly what that length is. We are working on pegging that down. It's going to depend a lot on river speed. It's going to depend on something called longitudinal dispersal coefficient, and also on temperature. And those three factors together are going to primarily describe what rivers are available to these fish to reproduce in. There are other things that may affect that, but we don't know for sure. Next slide. We did look at which rivers in the Great Lakes might have approximately 100 kilometers of river, and there are several. Next slide. But there's some uncertainty even on this. We do know that Asian carps, every place that they've been introduced and where they're surviving and where we have established populations, every place that we know of, and there are lots of them around the world, they had this minimum length of river. We don't know of any place where they've established and they're able to reproduce without that minimum length of river. And we've introduced, like grass carp here in the United States, hundreds of places, thousands of places if you count farm ponds. And there's never been any evidence that those fish could reproduce. But there is some doubt yet, because we can bring those Asian carp eggs into the lab and do a lot of things to them and leave them sit on the bottom, and they don't die. So what kills them? So we don't know. And there may be things that might happen in the wild that these, they would find a place where they could reproduce without this minimum length of river. We don't really know the answer to that. But we think they can't live without that 100 kilometers of river. We're just not totally sure. Next slide. So to sum it up, uncertainty abounds. The population growth, again, may be slow at first, may go on for decades even, and they could remain totally under the radar during that time. We may not even know they're there. But it's important to remember that a few fish getting into the Great Lakes doesn't mean it's game over. There are things we can do if they do get in, and a few fish doesn't mean that we have a population that's going to be self-sustaining. The Jurassic Park theory, life always finds a way, is not true. Most of the time, things do not survive. 90% of the invasions, introductions, do not survive. If life always found a way, we would not have endangered species. So this, you hear that, I'm sure, in the future. It's not true. Next slide, last one. Again, introduced individuals can survive and grow. In some cases, we know that. Again, Asian carp are amazingly flexible organisms. They are able to survive in ways that we wouldn't have expected. My good colleague, recently deceased, Bulu, was remarking to me, he's one of the real Asian carp biologists from China, and he was remarking to me that he just still couldn't believe that Asian carp could survive in our American river systems because they're so different from the types of systems in which they were evolutionarily developed. But so anyway, again, also some sectors less likely to be affected, and will they establish? Still don't know. We don't know for certain, and we don't know whether there'll be a problem. But should you be worried? Yeah. Next slide. That's it.
Before I begin, I want to share with you my greatest concern. I cannot begin to describe to you how many hours a week that I work, think, and worry about Asian carp. You might have seen that their eyes are at the bottom of their faces. I believe that if you see me here on this stage 1 year from now, my eyes too will be at the bottom of my face. Again, I'm Bill Bolin from US EPA. I'm a senior advisor in the Great Lakes National Program Office. But as I stand here before you, I want you to be aware you're not looking just at US EPA up here. You're looking at the Army Corps of Engineers. You're looking at the Coast Guard. You're looking at Fish and Wildlife Service. You're looking at the City of Chicago, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, the State of Illinois, the states of Indiana, and many Canadian provinces. What I'm going to present to you tonight is the framework that was announced at the White House the first week of February, the $78.5 million plan that we do believe will allow us to keep Asian carp from establishing a self-sustaining population in Lake Michigan. First slide, please. Here's going to be what I'm going to cover. I'm going to go through it pretty quick. I'm going to briefly show you the framework overview, cover the topography of the area, talk a little bit, just very briefly, about biology and science, talk about how we're approaching the framework with both short-term and long-term action items. By the way, there's 32 in the draft framework right now, but as of next week, you'll see 36 action items. I'm going to talk about the funding, and then obviously later on, be happy to take any comments. Next slide, please. Again, you heard me say our goal. We want to keep the Asian carp from establishing a self-sustaining population. I've talked about, the many partners that we have. As many of you know, there's current litigation going on with the Supreme Court, filed by the state of Michigan and joined by their states and 2 Canadian provinces. A message I want to bring to you today is we sincerely hope that we can get beyond litigation and begin cooperation. And I'm happy to announce to you tonight that even though the state of Indiana has enjoined that suit, they are working now with our partners in trying to find ways to stop Asian carp from entering through the Grand Cal and Little Cal. In the next few weeks, the Canadian Department of Fisheries and Oceans and 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec, also want to now re-engage to see what they can do to bring resources to bear. By the way, all these parties I'm mentioning, if you're aware of the eradication effort that occurred in CSSC in December, they all brought teams to that massive effort where we made sure the Asian carp couldn't get into the Great Lakes when the electric barriers were taken down. As you might have heard, the Army Corps has the electric barriers, but we got to acknowledge the fact that engineering will not be the only solution for a biological control. It's going to require all the tricks that we have in our toolkit. That's why the federal agencies and our state agencies have come together on the $78.5 million plan. It is an iterative document. At the end of my presentation, I'm going to give you an opportunity to provide comments. We can consider them as we go final with the framework in April. Next slide, please. Chicago, it's flat. Where's the water go? Well, as you know, it's an engineered system to bring the sewage away from the lake. And there's many entry points, by the way, where Asian carp can get into Lake Michigan, from as far north as Wilmette to as far south as Calumet Harbor. Next slide, please. Dwayne had already covered how they possibly got into the Mississippi River, so I won't reiterate that. Dwayne also did a very good job of characterizing the carp characteristics. eDNA, David did a great job on that, and David and his team continue to believe that eDNA equals the presence of live Asian carp. And we also concur that it is a great tool. We're very appreciative of David developing that tool. It's just a tool in our toolkit, though. And as many of you know, you've been reading in the paper, Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps, and IDNR have had crews out for the last 6 weeks trying to find any Asian carp that we can above the electric barrier. To date, we have not found a single live Asian carp. Again, I acknowledge the fact, using those traditional methods, they are difficult to catch. But we're out there trying, and if we find them, we're going to take an action. Next slide, please. Going to go into the framework very briefly. Go ahead and click ahead. We are looking at a wide variety of suppression measures. We're counting on David Lodge and the Army Corps increasing the number of eDNA samples that they can run through their systems. What we want to get to in this coming season is to have the ability, while they collect an eDNA sample, we can have a crew out there checking to see if there's any live Asian carp. We are looking at structural operation variations. Many of you in the audience have heard about the modified lock operations that the Corps of Engineers is considering. I'm also going to briefly talk about the structural barriers that are going to be placed in between the displanes and the CSSC and the INM and the CSSC. We are looking at many different emergency engineering measures. I see Dick Landing in the audience today. Metropolitan Water Reclamation District is putting some screening on some key points to prevent Asian carp from being able to move into Lake Michigan. We're looking at expedited biological control assessments that may include the use of rotenone again, kind of a strategic strike of rotenone, though, not applying it to a 6.5 mile of CSSC. And as you all probably are aware of, the Army Corps of Engineers is expediting the construction of Barrier 2B. They expect that to bring that up online by October of this year. Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly about what the Army Corps of Engineering is doing. A lot of these items are, the first 4 at least, are theirs. You're going to hear a lot of talk about the interbasin study. The Corps of Engineers is embarking upon an interbasin study for the entire Great Lakes Basin. They expect to conclude that study by the year 2014. They have agreed, though, to expedite the study, the interbasin study between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin. They expect to complete that study by 2012. And from these studies, they're kicking out efficacy studies. One of the efficacy studies that they recently put out is, and EPA funded, by the way, was $13.5 million, again, to create a physical barrier between the Des Plaines and the CSSC and do some engineered barriers to shut off culverts between the I&M Canal and the CSSC itself. So you can look forward to a lot more Army Corps efficacy reports coming out. They have 2 more that they're very close to pushing out the door in April. One of those will be for secondary barriers. These we're calling disco barriers because they involve sound, light, and bubbles. So those of you who lived in the 80s, that's why we're calling it a disco barrier. But these barriers apparently do have pretty good efficacy where the fish, the Asian carp, can be redirected into areas where they could be commercially harvested. They expect that efficacy study to be coming out for public comment probably within the next couple weeks. Another efficacy study you've heard about is the modified lock operations. That one's going to probably be coming out toward the end of April. That study has to look at not only modified lock operations, but what can be done for fish deterrent to support those modified lock operations. Commercial fishing and harvesting. It might be possible to reduce propagule pressure by getting commercial fishermen out there in the lower stretches of the Illinois River to knock them back. That's under control as well. And again, Geological Survey, which Dwayne represented, has about 12 items in the framework looking at biological controls, be it the biobullet, the specific chemical that can kill only Asian carp, to pheromone attractants and repellents. Next slide, please. This is a busy slide. This is from the Army Corps of Engineers. This is one that many of you have seen. That's why I just wanted to briefly talk about the interbasin study, which is here at the purple on the bottom. And up top are their efficacy studies that they're kicking out. But I don't want to spend much time on this. If you have more questions during the question and answer period about what the Army Corps of Engineers is planning on doing, be happy to answer that. Next slide, please. Many of you have heard talk about eco-separation or closing off of the canal from the rest of the system. We all acknowledge that this will cause massive disruption on a variety of levels. City of Chicago Rep Pat Carey is here tonight. City of Chicago uses the CSSC for emergency police and fire boats traffic. That would be disrupted. The Coast Guard also uses that for life-saving rescue. So there are public health and safety issues. There's obviously flooding concerns if you close off the CSSC. What are we going to do with all the water that is currently diverted away from Lake Michigan? Obviously, I know there's some industry reps here tonight, and I've had many hours of meetings with them. Obviously, there'll be impacts to commerce and economics. There are water quality impacts. There's going to be recreation and tourism impacts. You ask Wendella Cruise Lines and the Architectural Center people who use the Chicago Lock how disruptive it'll be to them. They say it will ruin their industry. It will severely impact tourism in Chicago, theoretically. And you've heard about the possible impacts to what could be a $7 billion fishing industry, commercial fisheries. So many things have to be considered by the variety of federal partners we're working with, and primarily by the Army Corps of Engineers in their interbasin study. Next slide, please. One thing I want to point out to you is there are many interconnecting waterways throughout the Great Lakes Basin. So when people say this is our problem in Chicago or this is Illinois' problem, it's not. It's the entire Great Lakes Basin problem. There is an interconnecting body of water between every one of the 5 Great Lakes states. Next slide, please. The framework. It was announced by the White House the first week of February. What a week that was in D.C. I've spent many weeks in D.C. The snow was truly unbelievable. In fact, if you might have heard of a press conference on the lawn of the White House, there was a press conference, but it was on the snowfield of the White House. The framework is broken into short-term action items and long-term. It's really balanced. Short term, we're trying to get these things accomplished within the next 60 days. Long term, we'll go at least to this fiscal year, if not even into out fiscal years. The funding source, and that's why I'm up here on behalf of EPA. What's our role as EPA? We're not fisheries management. We don't operate the locks and dams. We collaborate with our federal, state, and local partners. Through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the administration passed that $475 million plan. For this fiscal year, it's proposed for $300 million next year. We took $58 million of that pot of money and applied it toward Asian carp activities. And we do believe we'll be successful again in keeping that self-sustaining population from establishing itself. Next slide, please. Here it is. If you want to know more about Asian carp, go to the website, asiancarp.org, or go to the Supreme Court website if you want to see the preliminary injunctions and the amicus briefs and everything else that's been filed in the last several months. If you want to submit comments, we'd be happy to consider those comments. I'd ask that you try to get those in by next week. We do want to try to finalize the framework and the responsive summary by the end of April. If you've got any questions or want to contact me, there's my email address. Thank you very much for paying attention tonight, and wish us all the best of luck in keeping the carp out. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Our next presenter is Josh Ellis. He's been a program associate with the Metropolitan Planning Council here in Chicago since 2006, and he manages the MPC's water supply planning activities. And he's going to talk about some possible futures for Chicago waterway system. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. I am Josh Ellis. You can skip to the next slide. The Metropolitan Planning Council has been around now for 75 plus years. And I would like to think that I've inherited some of that sort of historical view on the development of the Chicago region, our interaction with Lake Michigan, our interaction with the Mississippi River, and the connections that are formed by the waterway system. We develop, promote, and implement policies that support a economically viable, environmentally sustainable, and socially equitable Chicago region. We work a lot on transportation and housing choices. I work a lot on water supply and stormwater issues. We cover a wide breadth of issues here in Chicago. Why am I here tonight? I really know not too much more about carp than most of you do. I know they're out there somewhere, and I know they fly or something, if agitated by boat wakes. And I know there's one a couple feet away from us in the aquarium that you should all take a look at. I'm not a carp expert. Carp's going to show up one time in my presentation. I'm here to talk about the Chicago area waterway system, how it makes interbasin species transfer possible, how it makes freight movement throughout the system possible, and how it makes a whole host of other things possible. I'm here to talk about how it worked in the 20th century, why it worked that way in the 20th century, what our 21st century goals should be, and how, as we take long-term approaches to this carp issue and to other invasive species issues, we might want to be considering our other 21st century goals for that waterway system. The waterway system, as it is typically described, is the canals that have been mentioned here, the Ship and Sanitary Canal, the Cal-Sag Channel, as well as some actual rivers. And those rivers have been channelized for the most part, but they are rivers. The Chicago River, that's right out there, the North Branch, the South Branch. This is a complex system. When I think of the Chicago area waterway system, CAWS, which you're going to see throughout the presentation, I also think of the incredibly, incredibly large system of pipes that pumps Lake Michigan water throughout the region, well beyond the city limits of Chicago. The city of Chicago itself has 4,200 miles of pipes to move Lake Michigan water around. That's just drinking water. That's before it becomes sewer. That's before it becomes wastewater and stormwater. That's 4,200 miles of pipes, and that's just in the city of Chicago. This is an immense man-made system to move water around the system, and it all ties back into what we want out of this waterway system. Next slide. All right, here's just a map. Here's just a map and some explanation of what I think the original goals were in reversing the river. All All right. Obviously, we were putting, most of you know, we were putting our wastewater into Lake Michigan and then pumping water out of Lake Michigan and then drinking it. This is pretty nasty to think about. Lots of people were getting sick. It was not a sustainable practice. And so reversing the Chicago River, connecting these two basins, somewhat ironically, is considered one of the great environmental accomplishments of the 20th century. And now here we are in the early days of the 21st century, faced with a whole host of environmental problems that resulted from it. As you can see, there were some river systems that have now been connected. The red lines there indicate locks, control mechanisms that boats pass through, water passes through. And we'll see maps later that show where some of our wastewater treatment facilities are. There's going to be a whole series of maps in this presentation. They all look kind of similar. The other point in reversing the river and connecting the two basins was to establish Chicago as a hub of freight movement. We have a majority of certainly in 1900, a majority of the nation's rail system went through Chicago. This was an opportunity to have waterborne freight moving through Chicago as well. It had the opportunity for intermodal transfers from boats to rail and to roads. And this was sort of a secondary goal in creating this system. These were, as far as I'm concerned, and I wasn't here in 1900, the two goals that sort of informed the reversal of the river and the creation of the system. Next slide. Now, thinking about those goals, we have to look at some of the positive and negative consequences from them. Here we go, another map. Okay. Doing that fundamentally changed the hydrology of the Chicago area. This entire gray area here is what is called the diversion area. Okay? This morning when it was raining, last night when it was raining, all of that water, all of that rain, as soon as it hit the ground, became stormwater. So it's nice rain in the air and it's problematic stormwater on the ground. That gray area indicates the area from which, before the river reversal, all of the stormwater would have filtered off into one of those rivers and eventually to the lake. There is an area directly along the lake, where we're standing now, where that stormwater would have gone directly into the lake. Okay? But this area here is what is now drained. This is our diversion area. And so when we talk about the diversion from the Supreme Court, this is what we're talking about. We'll talk a little bit about stormwater here in a couple minutes, but it's important to note that all of the stormwater that falls in Chicago and runs into our combined sewer, our wastewater and our stormwater systems are connected. All of that stormwater counts as water we took out of Lake Michigan. It's part of our water supply, and we lose it every day. 588 million gallons a day on average in 2005, which was a drought year. Next one. Oh, sorry, go back one. Sorry. And in 2005, it's important to note that we were using 88% of our allowable total. Now, this 3,200 cubic feet per second is actually a long-term average, and by 2020, it has to be down below that amount. We currently are down below that amount, and we've actually paid off our water debt to the other Great Lakes states. Not too long ago, 15, 20 years, we were well over our allowable limit at about 150% of the water that we're allowed to use from Lake Michigan. Okay. Also, important to note that in the waterway system, all this, the pretty water with the boats and the St. Patrick's Day stuff and everything, at any given moment when you're walking across Michigan Avenue and looking down into the water, that's 70% or more of that water is treated wastewater. It's effluent from our wastewater systems, okay? And there's also just some lake water in there to maintain navigation levels. But that is wastewater, okay, in our river, all right? And obviously the Stickney Water Reclamation Plant is the biggest in the world, treats immense amounts of our wastewater and stormwater, again, combined every day, and all of it goes to the Gulf of Mexico. Next one. Originally, Lake Michigan water was primarily used in the city of Chicago by Chicago residents and businesses. That quickly expanded with the expansion of our infrastructure system. And there's now this entire light blue area, most of Lake County, Cook, DuPage, all the way actually over into Kendall County and down into Will, now has access to Lake Michigan water. Okay? The population of our region is growing. We want more businesses to come here. We have this little thing called the Great Lakes Compact, which ensures that our water will stay here and not go to Las Vegas or China or anywhere else. We are going to have water in the future, but that means we have to manage it efficiently. We'll come back to this in a second too, but the areas out here on groundwater, some of that groundwater is deep aquifer water, which is sort of dinosaur water. It's really been there for a long time. It's deep underground. It's capped by bedrock. Those aquifers don't recharge in any sort of human timescale. And as you take water out, it doesn't really go back in. So we're effectively mining that water out. Fast-growing communities like Aurora, Joliet are reliant on those deep aquifers. And state data suggests that in the next 40 to 50 years, those water supplies will not really be there. So there are going to be more and more communities, and there already are, interested in connecting into Lake Michigan. Next slide. Certainly, the waterway system does allow freight movement. All freight movement is not equal. Not all of the freight coming into the system goes through the locks. Most of the freight that goes through a lock comes through Lockport, amazingly named, down here in the southwest corner of the region. And a lot of freight moves through the system, going through the Lockport lock, works along one of the waterways, and doesn't necessarily go through another lock into the lake. Some of it comes from the lake and doesn't go through a lock into the waterway system. Some obviously does. So obviously, altering lock operations in some way is going to affect a portion of the freight movement. Tourism and recreation, as the water got cleaner, largely due in part to the Clean Water Act and the good work at the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in cleaning up that effluent that's in our river, tourism and recreation have become much more significant parts of our economy and our way of life and sort of calling cards for the Chicago region. That was not the case in 2000. It is certainly in 1900. It is certainly the case in 2010. Next one. And as I hope you're all aware now, this connection also makes interbasin species transfer possible. Here's just a list that I pulled off one of these guys' websites. And there's a map that I took off one of their websites too, showing location of zebra mussel sightings over the last 10, 20 years. That's what interbasin species transfer looks like. It's species coming from one and going to the other. We've spent millions and millions and millions of dollars on any one of these things, let alone multiple ones. The round goby is what the electric barrier that we were just talking about was constructed to prevent, and now we're using it for Asian carp. So we've got zebra mussel solutions and Asian carp solutions and round goby solutions, and with climate change, we're going to need alligator solutions or something. Millions of dollars for each one. Okay? Next slide. I'm kidding about the alligators. So, lots has changed since 1900. Lot has changed except for the basic operation of the Chicago area waterway system. Wastewater treatment has improved. There's a lot of other people that use Great Lakes water. They use it, they flush it down the toilet, they clean it up, they put it back into the lakes. All of the water that comes in our pipes from Lake Michigan is treated effluent from Milwaukee and Buffalo and Toronto. So the idea that we're not somehow part of this cycle is kind of silly. Combined sewer overflow is what CSO means. This is in heavy rainstorms because our storm water flows into our wastewater. If there's a lot of rain, it can overflow the system. We're going to get to a slide here in a second that'll show some of those effects here in the Chicago region. It's just a reality, because of the way the system is built, that we have these combined sewer overflows. Like I said, the diversion is probably going to need to serve more of the Chicago region. We're going to have to expand the pipe systems. Western Lake County is looking into it. I believe Aurora is looking into it. And this is likely going to be a reality. The diversion, many states and some provinces historically were not happy with us because we were using like 150% of the water that we're allowed to use, as you can imagine. It also drains water from the lakes, which they're not too happy about either. Again, the more and more people want to treat the waterway system as a system of rivers. That means improving water quality for plants and fishes and all of those nice things that live in a river. Tourism and recreation are incredibly important. Highway congestion is increasing. You all know that. And so the opportunity to move freight along rail and waterways is even more important. And, interbasin species transfer. Next slide. So I would like to suggest that our goals for this waterway system need to be expanded. We had 2, largely about providing water for Chicago and about moving freight. I would like to suggest that we need 5. Probably there are more. This is what fit on the slide. So here are the 21st century goals. Improving the water quality and ecosystems, not just of Lake Michigan or the Chicago rivers, but also the Mississippi River Basin and all of its tributaries. Is there a way we can do better at being a steward of the quality of the water that we're taking out and putting into these systems? 2, we're already providing the Chicago region with water. It provides Lake Michigan provides 77% of the region's water, and we're probably going to need more. We want to enhance the capacity of our freight systems. We want to make it easier for freight to move from rail to barge and barge to rail and even to road. We would like to see more of that. Moving freight on barges is incredibly efficient in terms of energy consumption. Trains are only slightly less so. So the more we can have these intermodal freight opportunities, creates jobs, and hopefully saves carbon emissions from getting some trucks off the road. Certainly we want recreational and tourism uses, and we would like to eliminate the risk of interbasin species transfer. I would suggest these are good goals for us to be pursuing and any sort of long-term strategies that we're talking about in light of the Carp. Next slide. Just to go back to a couple of these. And these are highlighted in blue because nobody is talking about them right now. People are talking about freight. People are talking about tourism. People are talking about Carp. Nobody's really talking about the water that's in the waterway system. Here's a little picture of what happens in combined sewer overflows. If you have your wastewater treatment, you obviously can't read this. Wastewater, stormwater, when it rains, they overflow, and that water often has to be released because otherwise it would flood the streets, and that would be bad. Since 2000, there have been several storm events in which the locks at Navy Pier and O'Brien had to be opened, and raw sewage combined with stormwater was let out into Lake Michigan, which, yes, then we pumped back in and treated and drank. This is obviously not a good thing for a whole variety of reasons. It would be nice not to have these combined sewer overflows. Certainly, if we were to close the locks and not do anything to our wastewater treatment systems and then have a giant storm, there is the potential that that water would back up because it can't be released into the lake and would flood the system, flood out onto streets, what have you. And because of the combined sewer overflow, we've already put millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars into the tunnel, the TARP plan, the deep tunnel plan, which would catch a lot of these CSOs. It's not totally online yet. It will come online, but it's got a design system capacity. And as the population grows, as we get more businesses, as we get more people, as we get more pavement, it's very possible that even TARP, the deep tunnel project, could be overwhelmed. Next slide. And there's the regional water issue. This is a chart of population growth. The beige is Cook County. The blue is the collar counties. The orange is like the really, really collar counties. You can see that the population of the region is growing. A lot of it is growing in areas that do not currently have access to Lake Michigan water and who are facing constraints on either deep or shallow aquifers or the Fox River and, to a degree, the Kankakee River. We likely will need more water. We don't face water shortages right now. What we face are waste and inefficiency problems. Next slide. In the Chicago region, like I said, the stormwater and water supply are basically one system. Our stormwater is supposed to be our water supply. It's supposed to go into Lake Michigan, and it currently doesn't. All right? 27.7% of the 2000 diversion, which is 588 million gallons a day, which is twice as much as all of the suburban communities in the Chicago region take out of aquifers and take out of rivers. We have water. It's not necessarily in the right place, and we're flushing it all down the system to the Gulf of Mexico. Again, regional water shortages are possible, but water waste and inefficiency are problems every day. Every time it rains, we pay to get rid of our water supply. And every time we get rid of that water supply, it's water that we're either not leaving in the lake to improve the ecosystem there, or water that we're not pumping out of the lake to sell to somebody to get them off an aquifer. Millions and millions of dollars every year, gone. St. Louis appreciates it. They bottle it and sell it back to us. It's called Budweiser. Next slide. To reduce the stormwater loss from Lake Michigan, however, is kind of challenging because the river currently goes the wrong way. Like I said, stormwater in the Chicago region, in that gray area in that map before, most of it sort of wants to run off to one of the rivers and then back to the lake. There's only a small sliver of land right along the lakeshore where stormwater would run back into the lake on its own. So really, all of the great green infrastructure projects that are happening in the city with alleyways and green roofs and everything, that keeps stormwater out of the sewer system, which is great. It doesn't help us expand the region's water supply. It doesn't put that water back into the lake. So we're only sort of realizing half of the potential benefits of all of those projects. Okay? So you really need to use the water on site for something, like having it rainwater harvesting for a non-potable use, like flushing your toilet. There's really no reason we should be flushing potable drinking water down the toilet, let alone putting out fires with it, or washing your car. I don't know how many of you lick your car after washing it. You don't need drinking water to wash your car. And there are lots of innovative urban design strategies that could return stormwater to the lake. There actually are a couple places in Chicago where this happens already. The roof of McCormick Place, all the stormwater that falls on it gets filtered and goes directly back into the lake. South Lakeshore Drive, all the way down to the University of Chicago, the first wave of stormwater goes into the sewer system because it's got road salts and it's got oil and it's got nasty stuff. After that, it gets filtered and goes directly into the lake. There are ways we can return more water to the lake. But because right now only that thin band of land along Lake Michigan returns water sort of directly, it makes it a little challenging. Next slide. So here's my hypothetical scenario. And it's this kind of vision, not that I would call myself a visionary, but it's this kind of vision that I would like to think we could be talking about, not for what to do tomorrow or what to do the rest of this year, but what to do for sort of the long-term, 100-year growth of the Chicago area. What if we first improved our wastewater treatment to Great Lakes standards so that that water could go back into the lakes? And then when we talk about ecological separation, there's lots of chemical opportunities and biological opportunities. Well, there's a physical one too. Build a wall in the middle of the waterway system. I know these fish can fly, but they can't fly that far, right? If we were to physically separate inland from the wastewater treatment plants at Stickney and Calumet to right there and right there, and then allow the treated effluent to go back into the lake, you could actually leave the locks at Navy Pier and O'Brien open. I mean, tourism and recreation wouldn't be affected at all. They'd be able to go back and forth. And you'd have a physical separation to the inland side of the wastewater treatment plants, which are already providing the water. Make those physical separations your intermodal freight terminals. Make those places where it's highly efficient, very fast, for freight to be moved on and off of these barges to rail or to road. We can actually do a better job, make it more efficient, and move some of those current uses away from the lakefront, which then we could use for parks, wetlands, homes, things that we might want along the lakefront. Then we could re-engineer our streets so that more of them delivered stormwater back to the rivers, which would then flow back to the lake, increasing our water supply, and those physical barriers would stop the problem of an interbasin species transfer. Is this going to happen anytime soon? No, but we used to have big plans in this city. This was one of them back in 1900. We reversed the flow of a river and connected two mega hydrologies. We can do something like that again. Next. There's only a couple more. So, in theory, could that Quick, yep. Quick. Could that do all this? Yes. Next slide. If we start to think about all of our 21st century goals for the waterway system, and not just the carp, and not just the freight, and not just the tour boats, but if we take the water in the waterway system into consideration, if we work with our regional partners, if we work with the Army Corps, if we work with the other states, this is what David's going to talk about in a second, if we stop defaulting to this argument that, wow, that's just the way the waterway system works, that's just the way it is, as if Moses brought the schematics down from the mount. We built it, we can change it. It takes some will, it takes some foresight, it takes some coordination. It is not impossible. We need to stop making small plans, and we need to put our minds to it. I'm done.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, our final speaker tonight is David Ulrich, who's the Executive Director of the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. And he'll talk tonight about the need and potential for the sort of regional coordination that Josh has just alluded to.
Thank you very much, Ruben. Very dangerous to be batting cleanup at 8 on a Tuesday night when we've heard a lot of things about the carp and everything else. I will try to be as concise and to the point as possible. Picking up on Josh's last slide, maybe if I beam up enough here, we can find the solution. But it's going to take a little bit more than the iPhone or the iPad. But I think Josh has set the stage very well that we need to think way beyond the box that we are in right now if we are going to prevent 100 years from now, when none of us will be in this auditorium, but I'm confident that thanks to Melanie and other good people, the shed will be here and people will be coming to understand the kind of challenges we face. And I hope that we can come up with things in the very near term that will really, really be long-term solutions. Next slide. You've seen this plenty of times, so let's go right on to the next slide. I'd like to, let me first mention that for those of you who are not familiar with the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative, it's a coalition of 72 mayors from the United States and Canada around the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence that Mayor Daley started in 2003. We had initial focus on water quality, water quantity, and waterfront vitality. We're looking at a much broader range of economic, social, and environmental progress to really have a sustainable long-term future for this particular part of the planet. Obviously, there is a very long history of insults that we've all had to deal with on the Great Lakes. Hard to really point out which ones are the worst. Unfortunately, it's rivers catching on fire and lakes being dragged off to the morgue that it takes to get people really concerned about it. But certainly one of the great ones and one of the largest ones, and I think viewed certainly among the top 3, if not the top 1, has been the incredible biological insult that has been imposed by the introduction of invasive species over the years. As we've learned from the scientific expertise tonight, there are still a lot of unknowns, but certainly the threat and potential from the black bighead and silver could be one of the worst. Next slide. Melanie mentioned the tank up here with Asian carp that you can't see tonight. That is a picture of the tank from a few weeks back, and those are some silver carp in there. You usually see the flying variety. This is when they're actually in the water. Next, just to show you that this work on invasive species can be a very upfront and up close and personal activity. Part of my initiation as a commissioner on the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was to hang a sea lamprey off my arm. And, it's not for the faint of heart. Next, please. What I want to cover very quickly is how we got to where we are, what we need to do now, and what opportunities we might have for the future. Next slide, please. We've been talking about the Carp for much longer than I would like to admit, and there really shouldn't be any surprise that we are where we are right now. Even with all of that discussion, we weren't ready to the degree we needed to be. Thank God Bill Bolin got involved and really helped pull together in a way better than had been pulled together over the last 10 to 15 years, a real plan. And I know Bill worked with a lot of people on this, but it takes leadership like his to really get things galvanized and moving. Well, what have we learned from this, and what kinds of things can we do to be better prepared in the future? Next, please. I think we've made a big mistake, and what you've heard earlier tonight I think should help get us beyond that. There's really a tendency to focus on one big thing and look for the silver bullet. We've been thinking just about Asian carp. We've been thinking just about the electronic barrier for some period of time. At the same time, I think there is a recognition, and I won't engage in the hyperbole of, the superhighway for invasive species. This is a big pathway, and we've known and has been demonstrated a lot has been moving back and forth over the years. But we spent too much time just focusing on the carp and just focusing on the barrier, and we can't allow that to happen again. Next, please. For those of you who haven't been out there, there is Mr. Shea from the Corps of Engineers, who I think has done a fabulous job in terms of working on this. This is all of the above-water mechanics for the A, I think, barrier A, 2A, and then 2B is behind him, and there's construction work on that going on as well. Next slide, please. Well, how can we avoid the problem in the future? And let me say that we've got to do some short-term things. We can't just focus on mid and long-term, but we've got to look at all three at the same time. We've got to look beyond, as I've said a couple of times already, Asian carp. And I think there's a real preoccupation with just the navigational issues associated with it. Obviously, those are important things, but this is a lot bigger than just navigation on the Chicago waterway system. I will say that I think the work that Dr. Lodge has done with eDNA, and nobody likes lawyers and nobody likes litigation, but there's nothing like a little of that and a little eDNA to get people's attention and create a sense of urgency. You hate to have that happen, and you hate to have that to be necessary, but it did the job. I think the real question is that people, we're not seeing it in the papers and on TV every night anymore. People start to forget about it. I'm really pleased to see as many people out there now who still are concerned and want to learn more about it. We must maintain that sense of urgency in dealing with that. And as others have alluded to, the whole Great Lakes Coalition that we as mayors were part of, and the governors and the Indian tribes and the federal government came around with the Great Lakes Compact very well. With the litigation, that coalition started to fragment. One of the things that we have really focused on as mayors is trying to keep that together, because it is only if we work together on this that we are going to get to the solutions. Next, please. The short-term things, and we established what we called a statement of unity as an organization that focused on these things to try to highlight all of the things that we agreed upon, as opposed to just zeroing in on closing or opening the locks, the silver bullet that was tossed out there, and tried to focus on the broader range of things that need to be done. And I'm really happy to say that with Bill's work and the other federal state agencies and the Water Reclamation District, a whole range of short, mid, and long-term things are underway. Intensive work on getting a better idea of where the carp are, how many are there, where they are moving. Optimize the barrier and complete the construction, the flood construction work and protection work that's being done. really accelerating the work on coming up with a long-term solution. And as Bill mentioned, there are some alternative control strategies beyond the rotenone, working with pheromones like we've worked with for some time with sea lamprey, the bullets, the targeted bullets to treat the carp that won't hurt anything else. A lot of different options that are being looked at. That is all front burner stuff. Actually, it's going to be the public that's most important in keeping the pressure on everybody else to keep this moving forward. Next. In the midterm, we've got to keep focusing on trying to come up with a real long-term solution. Some of the ideas that Josh has presented to you. All of those actions that were established in the short term to keep the carp out obviously have to be continued, and particularly the monitoring to find out where they are. One of the things that really tripped us up in getting the barrier in place sooner was really dealing with the legal authorities and funding sources for that barrier. It was not a big amount of money when you look at federal and state budgets combined, but you would not believe the amount of time that was consumed in getting to the point where construction could proceed. We absolutely cannot allow that to happen again. Next slide. In the long term, we got to find out what is this real long-term solution and then really, really move forward with implementation of that. Next slide. And here's where it really gets tough. I think that if we proceed in just the traditional way that we have approached this so far, I don't think we are going to come up with a truly creative, long-term, sustainable solution. I have the utmost respect for all of the people who are working on this, but I think that there are a lot of constraints in the system in the way that it is designed that is going to prevent us from considering the full range of options and coming up with the full range of potential solutions that we are going to need. And again, it's well beyond just the carp and the invasive species, but how can we come up with a truly lasting solution? Next slide. Again, Josh mentioned a number of these. It's the movement of all the species. It's wastewater, stormwater, flood control, transportation. It isn't just about the barges and the tour boats. There's a lot more in terms of transportation going on here. I'm going to throw in the airport and all of the people and goods that are coming in as well. We really have to look at this in a multimodal fashion. The economic activity and development, and not just in this area. This has a huge influence on the rest of the Great Lakes system, and we have to know more about that. The ecological health of the system, how can we restore it in a way that is going to dramatically enhance property values along the shorelines of the water, deal with the water quality issues and everything else have to be part of this, and the social well-being of the region, the entire area, and the whole Great Lakes Basin. Next slide. So not just a normal process. I think we do have to follow the traditional processes, but I am convinced that we need some kind of a parallel and independent process, and I need to be very clear that our organization has not formally come up with anything or endorsed anything, but we need, I think that we need to find something that really has fewer constraints on it and has more ability to look at more creative solutions than we might otherwise be able to look at. If we have a parallel process, obviously the two need to come together at some point. Whatever process or processes we have must be totally open and totally transparent so the public knows what's going on, and we need to get ultimate and full buy-in and support. Again, I don't know what that process is. I don't know what the solutions are, but I think we've got to get going very, very quickly on trying to find them. Next slide. To wrap up, I think we have a chance of a century to do something right, and shame on us if we blow this opportunity. We need to get the best minds together to do this. It cannot be a business as usual thing. There's too much at stake, and it's too much of the magnitude of the project is just too large. And it must be a unified effort with just a relentless focus on ultimately getting to the solution. And if we do it right, the next slide is what we ought to be looking at. This is the chairman of our organization, the mayor of Grand Rapids, and unfortunately, it's a steelhead trout, which I understand were introduced to the Great Lakes in 1879, but pretend that it's an indigenous species, and we're all catching these wonderful, wonderful fish. But I really, really do think that we have a great opportunity. I think the right people are coming together now. But we have to approach this in a much broader and more creative way than we have in the past. You are a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite all the presenters up onto stage. And once again, if we could all thank the presenters for a really stimulating set of presentations. We have some time for questions. I've been told that we have to be out of the shed by 9 p.m., so I'll take the last question at 8:45. And there are some microphones circulating, so as much as possible we're going to ask the question into the microphone. But if it can't get to someone, then I will repeat the question for the purposes of the recording. Because we have less time than we'd hoped for, please, one question. And keep it as brief and to the point as possible. Do we have a first question? The gentleman here.
Blake Davis, I'm with Illinois Institute of Technology. I'm old enough to remember when there were cod in the North Atlantic. The Illinois River is only about 300 yards wide. I was wondering why we can't fish them out of the Illinois River and therefore reduce the population pressure.
So the question is, why can't we just fish the Asian carp out of the Illinois River? And I think that's probably a question best addressed to Dwayne.
Yeah, the answer to that question is it can be done to some extent. You're not going to catch every single fish, of course, but we do have models that indicate that if we harvest enough of the larger fish, that we should be able to have an impact on the population. And in fact, that is happening now based on my interviews with the people who are primary buyers of the fish. And I can't vouch for those numbers other than that's the numbers that they've been given to me. That in 2008, there were about 2 million pounds of Asian carp were harvested. In 2010, it's probably, 2009 is probably about 10 times that much. And they're predicting in this year that they will harvest probably about double that. It depends on a lot of different factors, but these markets are developing, and we hope that it will have an impact on the population and thus on propagule pressure towards the Great Lakes as well.
In the white here.
Okay, I'll just project. It seems like a very common theme among the presentations was, as Mr. Ellis put it, to eliminate the risk of interface and species transfer. My question really that I feel like wasn't addressed too much during the presentation is at what point does this kind of human control constitute a disruption of natural evolution? And to follow up with that, why is allowing this kind of species transfer considered not an acceptable solution?
So the question is, to what extent is human control of the species spread interfering in some sort of evolutionary process? I think David Lodge.
I'll take a crack at it. I think when you look at the natural processes, they occur on a much smaller and slower time scale. And what we're talking about, why we are concerned, not just in this area of Chicago, but globally when we talk about invasive species, what we're concerned about is that species by the thousands are being transported much greater distances at much more rapid rates than they ever would have achieved on their own. Now, it's not necessarily, I want to be clear about this, it's not necessarily that it's always a bad thing that a species moves from one place to another. We wouldn't have North American agriculture if we hadn't moved species from one place to another. But what we're concerned about is species that cause harm. And so when you unintentionally move species, it's very rare that anything good comes from that, and it's quite often that something very bad comes from that. When we're talking about species that we know are harmful and are moving, and we are in a position to possibly do something about it, that we should do something about it, and that's the situation we're in now in the Chicago waterway.
I guess if I may, though, to whom are they causing harm? I mean, what is the underlying problem if it's an issue of some fish species being depleted, other fish species are coming in? So it's not total depletion of natural life.
Others may wish to weigh in on this. The notion of harm is human perception of harm. That would be my definition as a biologist. Again, I'm not talking about it's necessarily harmful for a species to be moved from one place to another. It's harmful if people think it's harmful. I think if you were to go talk to people on the Illinois River and in other areas of the world where Asian carp, silver carp in particular, and bighead carp have invaded, you would find, if not uniformity, a large consensus that these fish are harmful.
Okay, can I jump in for 2 seconds? My guess is, just societal norms being what they are, every time there is the threat of an invasive species transfer, there will be a reaction of some kind that is going to cost us a lot of money. As David and I were talking about, there are a whole host of other things associated with the waterway system that don't really have to do with species transfer, but that currently are drains on public coffers and our tax dollars. Right? There are a whole host of reasons beyond this fish to be, playing with the waterway system and fixing it. I understand your point. I think there are other costs to be looking at here than just the cost of what the species can do to other species, or, as David's saying, harm to what we think of as valuable.
Okay, the gentleman here in the blue.
The multi-tiered framework that Bill Boland was outlining seems to allow the interbasin waterway question to remain open, while at the same time being key toward keeping the carp out of the Great Lakes. But we do have this long history of having other invasives that are not fish, they're plants and things like that, going in and out. If that plan is implemented on a multi-decadal time scale, do we risk accumulating a non-carp invasive species?
So the question is, if we continue what Bill spoke about with the multi-agency framework in perpetuity, or at least for several decades, what are the likely outcomes in terms of other invasions?
Yes.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just add a little bit to that.
I thought you might.
I think Senior Advisor to Administrator Jackson Cameron Davis says it best. For our framework, the ideal situation is that we keep the good things moving through the system, which is the traffic, and the bad things from not moving through the system. As you heard me say in my remarks, so far to date, there's been one solution, and that is an engineering solution through the electric barriers. That cannot be the only solution that needs to be put into place. That's why all the federal agencies that I talked about and the state agencies are coming together to do whatever we can, short of permanently closing the waterway. I'd also like to remind everybody in the audience, the CSSC exists because it is a congressional mandated navigational waterway. It literally would take an act of Congress or an act of the Supreme Court to close that waterway. But thank you for that comment and observation.
In the blue shirt here.
Thank you, sir. First, I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight. And second, my question is, what are the natural checks on the Asian carp species in their native habitat, and could those be imitated or imported here to where we are to keep the species in check? Thank you.
Historically, there were a number of huge predators in the Yangtze River and some of these other places. They had a species of paddlefish, for example, that's well over 20 foot long, and it actually had teeth like a shark. Our paddlefish is a filter feeder, but theirs was a big predator. But fishing is one of the options that has been put forward. It has certain drawbacks because if you create fisheries for these fish, there are more opportunities and more reasons for the fish might be moved around to new places, and it also establishes people that have their livelihood wrapped around it. So if we come up with a way to get rid of the fish somewhere down the line, it'll be politically difficult to do so with these advancing markets. So there are downsides to improving fisheries, but that is one of the things that is happening.
Lance?
Yes. Are there not other species of Asian carp that have become established in Lake Michigan?
Well, the common carp.
I'll just repeat the question for the people at the back. The question is about other species of Asian carp that may be established in Lake Michigan.
The common carp, which is Eurasian, it's native to Asia and Europe, is definitely established in all the Great Lakes. The common carp is probably one of the most damaging fishes in North America. It's partly because it's so well distributed. I don't know how much of a problem it creates in the Great Lakes. I don't know enough about the biology of the carp in the Great Lakes, but in shallow water bodies, it does tremendous amounts of damage. And if you call that one of the Asian carps, then yes. There has another Asian carp that has been introduced is the Crucian carp, but it apparently is extirpated. It did not survive. Oh, that's true. Yeah. That's also an Asian carp, but it's not. When you say Asian carp, it's not. There are goldfish too. There are actually 7 species that have been Asian carps that have been introduced. If you count the Crucian, the goldfish, and the common carp.
The lady in the green.
I have a question for Dr. Mott. With the eDNA technique, can that also detect dead fish parts? So it may not be live carp that you're detecting, but morsels of dead carp that have been distributed by fish.
It is possible. The question again was, could the eDNA approach be detecting a fish carcass? Could it indicate something other than the presence of a live fish? The answer is yes, it could. What we don't know is how persistent, how long that signal from a carcass would remain detectable. We do know from some laboratory experiments we've done that the signal degrades very quickly within a matter of hours or a day or two at the very most if you remove a fish. We don't actually know. We haven't yet had the opportunity to do an experiment where you had a fish carcass. So there are that and some other things you can imagine are possible ways in which you could get an eDNA signal without a living fish. What I think it's important to consider, though, is that I think even in aggregate, all the possibilities you might imagine are a very implausible explanation for the overall pattern of results that we've gotten repeatedly in space and time in the waterway. Does that make sense? We found the DNA, same place, repeatedly over time. I think it's highly unlikely that those results could be explained by something like carcasses.
So just a small note. That seemed to work. If the presenters could repeat the question before they answer it, that's a little less cumbersome than me doing it. I also want to mention that Bill Boland put up the email address. I believe it was carpcomments@gmail.com. We're not going to get to all of the questions tonight. Bill has offered to take questions at that email address and to forward them on to other presenters if necessary. So we do have a forum for hopefully getting some questions asked that we won't have time for this evening. Okay. The lady in it looks like a brown sweater.
I'm just wondering, this is kind of on the heels of other questions that have been asked. To what extent are native species able to compete and actually out-compete the Asian carp? And to what extent is the current status, the ecological status of the native species, sort of what's allowing the carp to come in and what's being done to promote the native species to compete with the carp? That makes sense.
I can cover the lazy edge thing, but go ahead.
Most of the information we have from around the world on Asian carp effects on native fishes is in lakes, not in rivers. What we have in the United States in terms of the effects data is just rolling out now. We now can show that fishes that have that eat plankton throughout their life are being outcompeted. In a study that we did at our lab, where you put paddlefish and bighead carp together in the same ponds, the paddlefish are outcompeted. So we know that bighead and silver carp are just about the most effective freshwater filter feeding fishes in the world. They're very, very effective. Very, like many carps, they're very highly adapted fish. But in terms of effects in the rivers of the United States, there's still a great fishery for catfish in the Missouri River, even though we're overrun with silver and bighead carp. If you can get out there and fish for them without having one jump into the boat and hit you, then their fish are there to be caught. So I'm not certain if I answered your question, and you had it.
Yeah, let me just talk briefly about what we're trying to do to prevent the spread of Asian carp through existing enforcement or legal mechanisms. I applaud the city of Chicago. 2 years ago, Pat, prohibited the sale of live Asian carp 3 years ago, prohibited the sale of live Asian carp within the city of Chicago limits. The second thing that's being done, the state of Illinois, through the IDNR, is currently assessing bait shops. We believe that there may be bait transfers, so they're making sure that those bait buckets aren't the source of possibly some spawning stock. The third thing, there's something called the Lacey Act, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is assessing whether or not there may be illegal importation of live Asian carp from states. That act prohibits the transfer of invasive species from state to state. Thank you for that comment and question.
The gentleman in the blue shirt here.
Yes, a question for Dave Ulrich. Most of these presentations tonight, with the exception of Dr. Lodge, were sort of, my interpretation, Chicago-centric. And you travel throughout the whole Great Lakes region with all the mayors. I don't think a lot of what was said tonight would necessarily play well in some other areas of the Great Lakes region. And I just wonder what you're hearing.
Well, I would disagree perhaps a little bit, Gary, in terms of how it would play. I think that particularly with the efforts that Bill has been involved in, the Canadian officials were involved directly in that effort, and I think there was a recognition that it was incredibly important to have a very intensive effort to, at least in the short term, try to continue to keep the carp out and from establishing populations. So in terms of all of the things that are being done short term, I think that there is broad support. A little concern that perhaps there wasn't a greater sense of urgency earlier, but now that that has been established, to me, the big issue, and I think, reflecting our membership, all the way out to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and then Duluth Superior, is will that be maintained over the long term? We do have some of our cities who have more of a shipping focus, and I think are sympathetic to the commercial and recreational boating interests that need to be factored in. But I think the general feeling is that it is an all-hands-on-deck situation, not just to put some rotenone in the river in early December, but to really find a thorough, comprehensive solution. And I think that we'll be watching very, very closely if this sense of urgency and intensity can be maintained. And if it is not, I think we're going to be hearing from all across the basin. And also, if we come up with solutions that are just Chicago area centric, I don't think that's going to pass the, if you will, Great Lakes and St. Lawrence test with the other states and the other cities. So we really have to think of this in a much broader scale.
The gentleman in the blue T-shirt.
My question is for Josh Ellis. Considering that so much of our rainwater is diverted away from the city, that there's more communities eventually wanting to tap into our lake water, would the huge cost of maybe overhauling the entire stormwater system be offset by those other communities coming into the system and maybe raising the water of the lake?
The huge cost would take a long time to get back through water rates, which would be paying for the cost of treating the water. No, any changes, any large changes to the waterway system, be it lock operations, moving locks, physical barrier, anything you do is not going to get paid for in any sort of near-term scenario through the water rates of adding some of those communities. Those communities, as it is, we underfund water infrastructure. We don't charge rates that actually reflect the cost of providing water. So we can't really hope to pay for more with that when we can't currently pay for water. So no, there would have to be an infusion of funds from the city, from the state, from the region. Yeah.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. The gentleman here in the brown jacket.
Is one way to solve the problem long term is to have biological treatment and recycling of the sewage in the Chicago area?
So it's a question for Josh about whether I think.
I mean, as one of my fellow panelists stated earlier, the fact that these fish are able to even survive in the waterway system now is because we're doing a better job of treating the water. If this were happening in 1910, 1920, these fish would be dead because not much was alive other than large amounts of parasites in the waterway system. So improving treatment of the water alone is not necessarily going to do anything about the fish. There have been some suggestions about using the wastewater treatment process to take oxygen out of the water and create a dead zone, but that would kill everything in the waterway system. And again, there is, I think, in the region, growing consensus that we should not be treating the Chicago area waterway system as a system of wastewater canals, in which case it might be okay to kill everything in there, but that we should be treating them as rivers, which is what they actually are, with the exception of some of the canals that were constructed. So I don't know if taking the oxygen out to kill everything would fly with the region as a whole. But no, just treating the wastewater is not necessarily going to do anything to the fish, other than make the habitat better for them to live in. I would like to see us return all of it to the lake, but that requires a huge investment in wastewater treatment to bring it up to Great Lakes standards, and then moving stormwater to one of the waterway systems of the lake. Yes.
We'll take one final question. The gentleman with the sunglasses.
Well, I know Mr. Chadwick was talking about how Asian carp are lake fish in some parts of the world and whatnot. But it seems, especially around like Starved Rock area and other river systems, they have ample food and spawning habitat. And with the presence of zebra mussels in Lake Michigan, and you even said in your presentation, that might deter them from going in further. I think there are more pressing matters in the lakes, like VHS, the possibility of VHS, and even issues like biomagnification. So while I have all you guys in the room at the same time, in all honesty, like on the scale of 1 to 10, threat of the carp, where does it rank compared to other environmental issues the Great Lakes are dealing with?
I'll take a first crack. My first response would be, it's not just about Asian carp. And I would put invasive species, and I think many other knowledgeable experts in the Great Lakes region, we can take a sample here, would say that invasive species have, over the history of the Great Lakes and looking to the future, been one of the major changes of the environment and of economic factors in the Great Lakes region. Just think about alewives and sea lamprey.
At the other end of the panel, I'll say a 9 for carp and a 10 for Asian species. I think it's real serious.
Okay, well, I'll draw it to a close. I'd like to thank once again our panelists who've taken a lot of time out to be here.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.